Hello everyone, welcome to J1 Aviation. So over time you hear a lot of advice, sometimes from an instructor, sometimes from reading an article, sometimes from, hey, watching a YouTube video. So I've put together a list of the top 20 pieces of advice for private pilots that I've heard over the past 25 years of flying and being in the aviation business. Now I'm sure many of you have heard some of these before, but hopefully there's something here on this list that you can take away. So these aren't ranked, they're just ordered by, as you would do a flight. So it starts with pre-flight, then in-flight, and then post-flight. So let's get started. Okay, so some of these go together and the first two are like that. So number one, it's better to be on the ground wishing you were in the air than in the air wishing you were on the ground. Don't push your personal limits. And then the second one is like that. Taking off is optional, landing is not. So some things can't be undone. There's no edit undo after you take off. There's no pause button as you're climbing out. Things just start happening and sometimes happening quick. So when you take off, you must land. So don't get so committed in your mind that the flight has to happen under any circumstance. Whether it's a training flight or you're taking a friend up or you're doing a trip somewhere, personal minimums are there for your protection and the flight can always happen at a different time. Personal minimums should consider a wide range of items, right? So first of all, like you, the pilot, how are you feeling? Physically, emotionally? Then the aircraft. Are you comfortable with the aircraft? Have you even flown the aircraft recently? Have you done takeoff and landing performance, weight and balance? Are there external pressures that are affecting your decision? And then the environment, the weather, ceiling, visibility, crosswind. Now, all of these kind of come together to form your personal minimums. And you want to keep your personal minimums because that's your wiggle room when things don't go according to plan after you take off. Those are your buffers. So that leads us to the next one. Meteorology is not an exact science. Be careful with those weather forecasts. So how often do you hear people joke about the weather not being correct, right? Yet sometimes we treat the TAF as like gospel. And the TAF has a ceiling or visibility right at minimum, so it's legal, it must be good, let's go. So of course the TAFs can be incorrect, the ceiling could be lower, the wind could be higher. If the TAF is borderline, just keep in mind that it could change. And you want as much wiggle room and options as possible because of number 4. The gas gauge is only correct when it's empty. Now, depending on the equipment you have in your aircraft, this may or may not apply to you. Some fuel systems can report quite accurate and precise values. The idea here is that you shouldn't rely solely on the fuel gauge. Visually check or measure the fuel load before your flight, know your en route burns, and then know your endurance times. So number 5, there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are very few old, bold pilots. Now this ties into the previous advice about not pushing your personal minimums. If you want to live to be an old pilot, don't fly like a bold pilot. Number 6, and I really like this one. A superior pilot uses superior judgment to avoid situations that require the use of superior skill. And this kind of ties into the previous ones. So being a good pilot isn't just about flying the airplane well, but using good judgment also. So as you can see with a lot of this pre-flight advice, it's about making good decisions even before the engine starts spinning. Number 7 is get a medical before you start training. So if you've already got a medical, congratulations. Flight training is expensive and there are medical requirements to be a pilot. Make sure you meet the medical requirements prior to burning your money. And then the last one I think regarding pre-flight is if it ain't right on the ground, it'll only get worse in the air. And this applies to almost anything. First off, me. If we aren't feeling well on the ground, chances are after you take off and get in the air, you're going to feel worse, especially if it's in your head and it's sinus related. The aircraft, if something doesn't seem quite right on run up, chances are, once you get in the air, whatever it was, the engine, the instrument, it's not going to get any better after you take off. And then also the weather, if the weather's borderline on the ground, it could be worse in the air. The slant range visibility could be less than what, the visibility is forecasted to be. So if there's red flags on the ground, make sure you listen to them. So listen to your gut. So moving on to some in-flight items. So continuing on the track of decision making, let's start with advice number 9. Don't push it when you know you shouldn't, and turn around when you know you should. So let's say on pre-flight, everything is good. Everything is above your personal minimums. I mean, that doesn't mean everything on the flight's going to go smooth. The atmosphere is constantly changing. NOTAMs can pop up. The aircraft might start sounding funny, and you might not be feeling so well. So if you start to feel like you should turn around, or it's starting to feel like you're really needing to push it, then maybe you need to stop and consider and think about what the best thing is to do in this situation. Number 10, push to talk, don't push to think. So this one's kind of funny. I think we've all been there when you're trying to learn the radios. You know, you need to make a radio call, but you don't quite have it down in your mind what you're going to say. So you just key the mic and hope for the best. Not a good approach, but we've all been there. I mean, everyone messes up on the radios. You hear it all the time. The best thing you can do is just practice at home, chair fly, practice your radio calls in your mind or out loud, and it will come. And there are also some good online apps which can help you learn radio skills. Number 11, look to thine airspeed, lest the ground shall rise up and smite thee. Maintain your airspeed, very important. Some of you may watch Dan Greider's videos, and he really preaches about bringing airline concepts to general aviation. And part of this is having a minimum maneuvering speed when you're flying. His stance is to understand your aircraft's minimum maneuvering speed. So with this speed, you never want to go below it. He recommends using a defined minimum maneuvering speed, which is 1.4 times VS1, which is the stall speed at the bottom of the green arc. So that's your minimum speed. As you're flying around, always be above that speed, maintain above that speed in the pattern. And then that will give you a cushion on your airspeed when you're climbing, banking, working your way around the pattern. Then when you're established on final, you can reduce that minimum speed to like 1.3 times the bottom of the white arc. Then that will be a minimum speed on final. And the idea is just having these minimum speeds in mind that you never want to go below, and that'll keep you safe. And then of course, as you're approaching the runway and you're transition to your landing, then of course you're going to be flying your landing speeds. But the idea is to have in your mind or bugged on your airspeed indicator some minimum speed that you never want to go below. And this will keep the ground from rising up and smiting you. Now, talking about important things, number 12, the most useless things for a pilot are 1, the altitude above you, 2, the runway behind you, and 3, fuel you left on the ground. Now this all goes into like setting yourself up for success. 99% of the time, these things won't bite you. You know, selecting a cruising altitude which is low because you're enjoying the scenery, doing an intersection takeoff which reduces your available runway, departing with less fuel than you should. But there comes a time when the engine might start running rough, or you're not accelerating on takeoff like you should be, or you have deviations on your cross country and you're burning up the fuel load. So, I mean, for this piece of advice, you just want to make sure you're setting yourself up for success and don't leave yourself shortchanged. 13, aviate, navigate, communicate. So you can't tell people where you are and what you're doing if you don't know either. Now this could be applicable to emergency procedures as well as standard operations. First and foremost, fly the plane. As PIC, that's your most important task. Secondly, navigate. Figure out where you are, where you want to be heading. And then lastly, communicate, whether it's to ATC or maybe on the traffic advisory frequency. 14, treat every approach as a go around with an option to land. So the idea here is that you can always go around. If you don't like the approach, go around and try it again. Remember, a good landing starts with a good approach. It's hard to make a good landing from a bad approach. Pilots are generally optimistic people. We tend to think our piloting skills are fantastic and that we can salvage any approach no matter how bad the base or final looks. But let's not let that be our mindset. You know, do you have a controlled descent? Is your speed where it should be? Are you properly configured? Have you done the checklist? If you aren't where you should be on any of these items, then you should go around. It's that easy. Any landing you can walk away from is a good one. Any landing you can reuse the plane again is a great one. So this one's a little funny. I mean, obviously we're not measuring landings by if the plane is still usable. To achieve a good landing, it just takes practice. You need to have some time in that specific aircraft if you want to achieve really good landings. It's about staying ahead of the plane. It's about knowing how the plane will respond to various inputs. And then once you understand all these different parts, it's just about making slight adjustments here and there as you are guiding the plane towards your aiming point on the runway. Okay, so then we have one on emergency landings. If you are faced with a forced landing, fly the thing as far into the crash as possible. The key here is to fly it to the crash point, meaning don't pull back and try to stretch the glide and then end up stalling it. Push the nose down, keep your airspeed up. We all hope we never find ourselves into this situation, but fly the thing as far into the crash as possible. And then we have a couple just to finish up here, which are just general good advice. These next two go together. So 17, your private pilot certificate is a license to learn. And 18, a good pilot is always learning. Credit to Jason Shepard, who always mentions this one. So after you get signed off with your private pilot certificate, you now know just enough to pass the test. Congratulations. However, other than your flight review every 2 years, there isn't really any required structural learning that you have to go through between these time periods, unless you're like going on for more certificates or ratings or something. In the airlines, there's always continuous learning opportunities, but not so much for general aviation. And there will always be regulation changes, new policies, new recommendations, and also very importantly, there's a lot to gain from experience. It's one thing to read about it and understand some topic in a book, but it's another thing to go out and do it and learn it and master it and become proficient at it. So yes, as a pilot, keep learning. You'll not only help yourself, but others along the way. Next one, number 19, it's never too late to begin flying. Okay, so at some point, it will become too late to begin flying, but that's not the point here. You hear people in their 40s say, I've always wanted to be an airline pilot. Is it too late? No, you see those things happening. Sometimes someone retired and they're 60 years old. Is it too late for them to start working on the private pilot license? No, it's never too late. Of course, the longer you wait, it doesn't make your path any easier. But if you are on the fence, go for it. The journey's worth it. And then lastly, a perfect flight doesn't exist. Always debrief yourself after landing. So as pilots, we take pride in flying and striving for excellence, especially if there are passengers on board. We want the perfect takeoff, flying precise altitudes, airspeeds, radio calls, and then lastly, the perfect landing. I mean, occasionally some of these things might happen, but the perfect flight, it may not exist. And this goes back to that advice about always learning. Debrief yourself after the flight. What didn't go as planned? What can we learn? Every flight is an opportunity to learn. If you don't go back and think about how you can improve, then the learning opportunity was missed. So there you go, everyone. My top 20 pieces of advice that I heard. Feel free to share any others in the comments I might have missed. Thanks everyone for riding along today. We hope you enjoy your flight, and thanks for flying J1 Aviation.